Hello everyone. First of all, I have to say that it's difficult to make a generalization for a huge continent like Africa, where the countries differ a lot from each other in economical performance. But if I have to do so, I have to say that I find it unlikely that we'll see a major rise of the African continent, and where they will play an important role in the global economical system like East Asia are currently doing. And the reason for this is that in general, I think it takes a lot of time in order to make huge economical performances. But also because I think that Africa lacks a lot of requirements that are necessary in order to do so, both culturally but mostly politically, where there's huge political instabilities throughout the entire continent. And also, I think a comparison can be made with, for example, Eastern Europe, which many people thought that we will also see a major rise after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But now, after 25 years, we can still see that the region has had a lot of problems catching up with Western Europe. However, though, I do think that we will see economical development in Africa, but unfortunately, I don't see a major rise within the upcoming 25 years at least.
Hi, my name is Edward, I'm 22 and I'm studying international relations at Veruch, and I've been asked to comment on a question of either I do believe that the African continent is rising or not. First of all, I want to say that it's definitely a controversial question to ask since we're speaking about the full continent with 56 countries included, and to judge of either all of them develop equally well or not is super difficult. But from my spontaneous perspective and from the subjective comment I can give is that I do believe that Africa is rising. Yes, I'm not sure if one can use this term in the way it is presented, but definitely we see it on the examples of Ghana, Kenya, South Africa. These countries develop quite well, and I hope that Africa gonna rise in future. Let's just maybe not use the term of Africa as a full continent rising. Thank you.
So, I think the question of Africa rising is a very complex one, and there are no easy answers to it. I think Africa definitely has the potential to rise, given the natural resources and economic abilities that it certainly has displayed in the past. I think with future investment and current investment as well, there is certainly the potential for it, but it largely depends on what the national governments of the African continent do with that investment. And I think if they can channel it into infrastructure, education, and manage to resolve their conflicts that they have internally and externally, then there's certainly potential for it. Although I think there are many hurdles that they have to overcome in order to do that. I think also in terms of longer term projections, countries have to consider investing into education. They have to look at who they are as a continent and whether they can overcome their issues in terms of cultural diversity, and whether it would be beneficial to form an African identity based on the continent as opposed to individual countries, and how far that can extend into it. So based on those things, I believe that there is definitely potential, but it is an area that is not easily identifiable, or maybe not identifiable, but it warrants further investigation.
My name is Joaquim Mabula. I'm a clinician from Tanzania. I'm now studying at Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. Yes, I believe Africa is truly rising because there is more advance in different sectors, including health, education, good governance, human rights, business, and economics. Setting an example of Tanzania, the majority are being educated from primary school to secondary schools, where they don't pay, they get education free, and most of the basic things of human rights, politics are being taught in secondary and primary schools. So people are aware of their rights and they know how to get them and where to demand them.
Is Africa truly rising? Well, to be honest, that's a kind of hard question to answer, really sincerely, because I don't really know that much about Africa. But nevertheless, I've been working on a project to deliver a mobile game to Ghanaian students, to students in Ghana, and therefore had to do a little bit of research about the target group, and now I know a little bit more, not too much, but still a lot more than I knew at the time when I came to the Netherlands. So now that I know a little bit about their lifestyle, how do they dress, how do they look like, how do they live, what do they do in their free time, and so on, I would say that yeah, Africa is truly rising, and it's more closer to the Western, becoming more closer to Western civilization than we think or we may think. Cheers, Diggy.
Afrika Afrika kwa sasa hivi tuna maendeleo ukilinganisha na miaka kama 30 nyuma iliyopita. Maendeleo ya Afrika yanachangiwa na vitu vingi au inaonekana kwa sasa kwamba kuna ukuaji wingi wa viwanda, barabara, biashara na teknolojia. Unaona, nchi nyingi za Kiafrika sasa hivi utakuta kwamba vimeendelea, kuna viwanda ambavyo vinazalisha barabara nzuri, matreni ya umeme. Yaani hivi vitu ukiangalia hivi sasa ni tofauti na pale mwanzo. Hivi vitu mwanzo havikuwepo. Kwa hiyo Afrika, ukisema Afrika kuna maendeleo, ni kweli maendeleo yapo, kwa sababu kuna hospitali makubwa, watu wanafanya upasuaji, hawahitaji tena wakati mwingine hata kwenda nje ya nchi kutafuta huduma kama hizi. Kwa hiyo haya ni maendeleo ambayo yanaonekana moja kwa moja. Alafu kuna yale tu maendeleo ya mtu binafsi ambayo ndio kumuona nayo, kwa sababu Afrika kuna mtu mwingine anamiliki mpaka ndege yake binafsi, kuna mwingine anamiliki hoteli za kifahari. Haya ni maendeleo ambayo yanaonekana, ingawaje hatukatai kwamba bado, lakini kuna baadhi ya watu au vitu ambavyo vipo vinaonyesha kwamba ni moja katika ni maendeleo ya Afrika.
My name is Akim Mwape. I'm a PhD student at ASC University in New Zealand. In my research, I'm trying to understand how the linkages between international, national, and local policies are working, and I am particularly focusing on the governance of national parks. Africa has been described as a dark continent, a shackled continent, and some commentators have concluded that the future of Africa is bleak. To some extent, this description has some merit in it because of Africa's past history and the current happenings in some African states. However, there is currently a new generation of young, vibrant Africans who have embraced the African rising dream and are desperate to steer Africa to new heights. Already there has been some progress in a number of African countries. For example, in the economic sectors, African economies have begun growing again, and some countries are expected to deliver strong growth rates between 6 and 8%. In the natural resources management sector, there has been a growing realization for the need for sustainable exploitation and use of natural resources. Many African countries have taken steps to strengthen their legal and policy frameworks by integrating the principles of sustainable development in as articulated by international frameworks. However, there is still a need to continue building capacity across all African nations.
My name is Andrew Chilufya. I'm a PhD student at ASC University in New Zealand. My PhD topic looks at corporate social responsibility and community development, focusing on the tourism sector. My opinion on Africa rising. The question is Africa rising? I think the idea has some merits. However, I think Africa is not yet there. Let us take, for example, the issues of governance and accountability. Although, admittedly, two countries such as Zambia and Ghana have been making progress in democratizing their vital political processes, but they are not yet there. And there are many other countries in Africa, just like them, they are not there. So is Africa rising? My opinion is we are celebrating too early.
If Africa is rising, of course I do believe that Africa is rising. Looking at improved standards of governance, expanded manufacturing sector, a thriving tourism destination, improved access to education, healthcare, ICT, I think Africa is on the road to massive development. As Mikasa points out in the Africa Rising song, Africa is the land of honey and the land of future money. So, of course, Africa is rising.
Do I believe Africa is truly rising? I don't think I can answer that question, because what do we define rising as? To me, that encompasses sustainable development and growth. And I think Africa is not at a point where I can say that we have sustainable development and growth. Our economies over the past few years have increased and are doing better, but that's not the only way we can define rising. I do believe, however, that Africa is getting a lot of recognition, and a lot of people, a lot of governments, a lot of organizations, a lot of individuals have realized the potential and the resources we can provide, and that's often termed as Africa Rising. But in more practical terms, how does that development affect the people at the grassroots level and the people at the community level? So once those people begin to see the changes for the betterment of their life, then I would say that Africa is rising.
To consider four aspects. One is the economic sustainability, which includes donor funding and the corruption in a country. Secondly, political maturity, including political commitment and democracy. Third one is security, and fourth one is health, which is related to the vital statistics of any country. If you come to see these four aspects in Africa, I'm afraid I'm a little skeptical about it being called rising. When you see about, let's start with the health statistics, it is the poorest health statistics in terms of maternal mortality, newborn mortality, and adult mortality, life expectancy, and other issues. We're still dependent on sending our patients to India and South Africa and other countries where the same countries cannot afford to do the high-tech surgeries and treatments for their citizens. When you talk about security, you look at Nigeria, the Boko Haram, the Shias being killed without any cause. You look at Egypt, you look at Libya, you look at South Sudan and North Sudan, you look at Somalia and the pirates, you look at Ethiopia, and therefore you come down and any of the African countries, you will see that security is still a major problem. If you look at political maturity, we start remembering people like Lumumba, Nkrumah, Nyerere, and Mandela. These are leaders of exemplary nature. The political commitment, the democracy is still missing, which you can see from a recent example of the elections, the re-elections in Tanzania, especially the Zanzibar one. And therefore you see leadership, citizens' rights, political awareness, all comes into it. And when you scan through all the African countries, you find that there is still need to have this in place. When you come to economic sustainability, most of the African countries are still donor dependent and dance at the tune of the donors. We are, for example, in Tanzania, 52% of our government annual budget is donor dependent. Even 50 years past independence, we are still donor dependent. It's all because the four things which I have mentioned are missing. And therefore, I think Africa is yet to rise. Although we have high rises, buildings and structures and roads and infrastructures visibly being seen to rising, but actually if you look at a country level, it is only a few patches where it is rising. If you go down in the villages and down to the lowest people, Africa is still far, far away from rising.
Is Africa rising? Yes, I believe Africa is rising, however at a very slow pace. Although the continent's GDP, population growth and infrastructure has been increasing for the past 5 years, the continent still faces major challenges, especially when it comes to politics, foreign investments, bureaucracy, immigration and law. The lack of a proper law and order system, combined with long bureaucratic procedures, is what keeps foreign investors away from investing in African countries. Apart from that, the greed that majority of the African leaders and politicians have for power, what causes stagnation and hinders further development.
Africa's on the rise. Hey, wait a second. Are we really on the rise? With all these political and socio-economic taboos, I have a doubt on this rise. Not that we can't, but we will. Economically, we have shown that we have the potential, yeah? The solution lies where we should be our own engines to spark this comprehensive rise. You know, those who talk too much, get them out of the political system. And that is when we can come and do something for our continent. Thank you.
Is Africa really rising? Yes. In many African states, we've seen a 2% increase in GDP. As well as this, many African states are making headway with these MDG goals set previously by the United Nations. We're seeing a growing emergence of middle classes. These are people that have money to spend. Key examples being Nigeria, Kenya, and other African states. As well as this, we're seeing many sectors booming, not just in the mining sector, we're seeing agriculture and manufacturing. So yes, in terms of Africa, it's diversifying from the standard mining sector. On the other hand, is Africa really rising? No. Reasons being is that there is still some headway to make with the Millennium Development Goals post-2015 in key indicators such as child mortality, poverty reduction, promoting universal education, HIV/AIDS, and dealing with other tropical diseases. A key example being the case we saw with West Africa with the Ebola situation. In terms of trade, there is still some headway for Africa to make. Yet, we still have to be at the forefront of negotiating what is meant for the states and also what is going to be beneficial for everyone. Not just those that are at the top, but also those that are also at the bottom. So in conclusion, yes, we can say that Africa is rising, but yet there is still some headway to make.
First of all, let us clear the air on the fact that the term has always been linked to Africa's growth economically. That's the greatest fallacy of this whole great tradition of trying to see Africa rising in actual fact. But I believe categorically, firmly, and certainly that Africa has been rising for the past 60 years. First of all, we rose consciously in us actually being able to determine ourselves, being led by the likes of Julius Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah. Then we started growing politically, where our states actually started believing the sake of democracy and the idea of democracy, where people have the right to choose where they need to be and where they'll go. In the next 10 to 20 years, and maybe even for the next 50 years, Africa will be reaching that last level which we seem to define Africa rising on only, which is economically and culturally. But in the essence of this whole idea, I believe Africa has always been rising by like the greatest giants that have been sleeping for a long time. It takes a long time for them, the world, to see our true strength. And that is us being towering over the rest of them.
Africa rising. That's a question that brings up more questions than answers. When you look at it as a whole, Africa is a continent. So to say, is Africa rising? We're asking, are all the countries rising together? That would be no. Some countries are rising by themselves. Some are attempting to rise. Some are still in between, and some are just stagnant, staying exactly where they are, not moving at all. But now, when you ask that question, who are the ones who are rising? Is it the country as a whole, or is it just a select few individuals who have that opportunity to rise? And that's the actual truth of the matter. And when you look at it from a bird's eye point of view, basically the ones who are rising are the elitists, the very well connected, the ones who basically run the country, and those who are able to get the business opportunities to make things happen. The ones who are not rising is the majority of the people within the country, the economically less well off. Because from what I can see, they're pretty much in the same position that they're in. They're feeling the effects of this so-called Africa rising syndrome, because they're not rising, unfortunately, as much as I would love for them to be the risers, but no. So, is it? No. What has happened? Infrastructure is grown, economy is growing, inflation is supposedly also growing too, but that does not add on to the whole Africa rising phenomenon. And this is Will. That's my perception on things. Thank you.
I'm Kobani from Cape Town, South Africa. Okay. Do I think that Africa is rising? I have no idea who actually came up with that, but I feel like Africa has always been rising. I think it's a marketing campaign which probably has good intentions, but I feel like it fails to recognize that Africa has been rising. Africa has been prospering in some areas, and it only does not rise when the Western eye is finally recognizing that we're rising. But we always have been rising. We just have not been getting the recognition that we deserve. One story has been sold about Africa, and now that the world has finally come to realize that we've been sold one story, it does not mean that we're starting to rise now. But there's a lot of good things that happen in Africa. It's time that the world recognize that, I guess. But we're not just starting now to rise. We've been rising.
My name is Amal Shiuji, and I'm a filmmaker based in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. When we talk about Africa rising, I think we have to take in consideration who is Africa rising for and whose backs is it rising on. Too often do we see the negative images, the stereotypes, and we have taken responsibility to fight it, to create a struggle to fight it in media, in the academic world, also in just everyday lives. But at the same time, we can't go to the other extreme. When we talk about Africa rising, GDP and statistics and all these graphs and pie charts cannot substitute for human dignity and humanity, just generally in our societies. We still have classism. The class divide is increasing. The urban elite are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, the divide between rural and urban is increasing. How are we addressing it? It's getting into other situations like xenophobia in South Africa and racism in other places. And the real crux of the question is about the class divide is there. And how is Africa rising? How can we talk about that by just simply saying that we have more billionaires in Forbes magazine from Africa? That does not represent the entire continent. We have to address these issues, and it has to come from our own perspectives. I think that's an important question.
All right, yeah, I believe Africa is rising because economically, like, it's the fastest growing continent around the world. Also population-wise, it's soon hit a billion people soon. But I think it's going to have problems of corruption and stuff that could be in the face of that. But if it gets over that, yeah, Africa could be a proper superpower. Like maybe we won't see, like, this is an Asian century, but maybe we'll have an African century next century.
I feel that Africa is rising because there's a lot of potential for growth in the continent. The main barriers and limits to this potential growth is due to connectivity, mainly electric, and obviously the internet connection that comes with that. I feel that Africans are now becoming they're almost becoming consumers of the world market when they need to become producers of it. We need to have more African content online, and that will obviously boost business growth and startup companies, and obviously the GDP of countries will rise. I think that Africa has been rising for a while now, and that a lot of the records that show this in terms of GDP have been outdated. So we do need to make sure that we're tracking the growth that is available on the continent, especially in the sub-Saharan region of Africa. I feel that in terms of most potential areas of growth, such as education, health, Africa's making huge leaps forward, and I know that we'll continue to do that, especially as we enter more internalized African development, where we're not looking externally, we're not looking towards Asia and Europe, we're looking to trade amongst ourselves in order to boost our own potential to achieve that.
So the question was, is Africa really rising? I think that's an interesting question. I feel like, yes, Africa is rising. In pure economic terms, the fact that African economies are doing a lot better. There are a lot of investments. There's a lot of very visible change and developments that are going on. However, I feel for the majority of the African population, they would probably disagree with the rise or the economic change having any effect on them, because a lot of them still remain very poor. However, there's a growing middle class, which is also very visible in a lot of African countries. But I feel like predominantly this term Africa rising is kind of to legitimize the West's change from aid to trade and the focus on industrialization in Africa and industrialization in a lot of African countries, which is also has been the focus of countries themselves. Tanzania as well. The current government is focusing on industrialization and an industrial revolution. So in that sense, Africa is rising. So both yes and no.
Hi. I'm Tegan. I live in Botswana. And if I'm being completely honest with you, I'd never heard the phrase or term Africa rising before. So for me, I'm going to put my opinion across as purely from an infrastructural/developmental point of view. If we're looking at it in that sense, I would say Africa is definitely rising. If I look at the way, for example, the CBD in Botswana has developed from 11 years ago to what it is today, then it's booming. And I would definitely say we're rising in that respect. I personally don't have enough knowledge to speak of it from a political point of view. But if we're looking at it from a infrastructure point of view, and the way things are developing, then yeah, I would definitely say Africa is rising. Can't speak for other African countries, but I can definitely speak for Botswana, and for Botswana, we're doing pretty good.
Right, so I'm agreeing with Africa rising because I've recently talked with the representative of the World Bank in Brussels, and he explained us all that they're developing projects that need to be implemented right now, which speak about gender equality, eliminating extreme poverty in Africa, creating infrastructure and access to waters and primary resources, which is vital. And because we are implementing those basic elements, then Africa will prosper. And the second element that I want to talk about is the involvement of the youth. They're encouraged to do field research so that they can see the situation in the African countries themselves, and then sort of publish, make public the information that they get from it, whether it's good or bad, and how can they improve the systems. And with our help, I think Africa will prosper.
So to answer the question whether Africa is rising, I would say definitely. As I am from Zambia, born and bred, we have a lot of copper there, and obviously the whole continent of Africa has a lot to offer. Minerals, livestock, agriculture. South Africa has some very good education, some really good universities. I do not have a lot of factual information about all the countries in Africa, because it is a very large continent and very diverse. But I would say definitely it's not rising exponentially, but it is one of the continents that is really rising.
Well, for Africa to rise, it needs to grow a wing. And I don't think it's possible to grow a wing using a corrupted institutions, using a system which only serves few rich individuals, and without fulfilling the basic needs of the majority. So I would like to correct the statement by saying few African countries are jumping. And I think this could be possible using 3 ways. One is by getting a loan from a developed country. And the second one is by selling the natural resource, where 2/3 of the profit goes to the foreign company. And the third one is if the media lies about it. But this is what I think today. Maybe I'll change my mind tomorrow.
Is Africa rising? I think the answer is yes. But it is a definite yes seen through a global and relative lens, where you compare it to the decreasing power of the Western states and the fall of the Western Empire. I think that there will be a soon impending fall of the Western Empire, and we need to be careful that we fill that with something of ours and that we do not just get new colonizers. And I also think that this fall of the Western Empire will result in a lot of Africans abroad coming back to Africa and contributing in Africa. And I also think that the rise of Africa is evidenced by the export of music, food, and inventions. Like, I can mention, for example, Kitanka cars, cosmetics, different kind of things. But my greatest concern is that the rise of the African status, and it does not reach the people, and that people do not benefit from actual development that's happening. And no one should be left behind. We're all Africans at the end of the day.
Hi, so this is my opinion on whether or not Africa is rising. I do believe to a large extent Africa is on the rise. There's a lot of positive development, there's a lot of investment, and I think regional bodies such as SADC, for example, are working more closely together to achieve a common goal. At the same time, I think a lot still needs to be done. The poverty levels are still high. Security in some parts of the continent is threatened. So I believe if countries continue to work together in peace, then indeed Africa can continue to rise.
All right. Hey there, everybody. My name is Kuzuasa Chikonye. I'm a Zimbabwean studying here in South Africa. I'm studying toward an engineering degree, electrical and computer engineering at the University of Cape Town. And I've been posed the question, do I think that Africa is rising? I think I'd like to answer that in about 3 points as to reflect on my thoughts about whether Africa is rising or not. I come from a very impoverished nation, impoverished by its leaders and its leadership, and that actually leads into my first point, which is that I think when we define a nation as rising, we should be able to see economic progress, we should be able to see political progress, we should be able to see even progress on a individual level. I mean, overall well-being of an individual, and reflecting on the leadership in Zimbabwe, which is central to the political progress and the economic progress, and also the individual progress of the different peoples of Zimbabwe. I look at our leadership in Zimbabwe, and I look at the leadership in South Africa. Those are my 2 closest nations. And then reflecting on the rest of the leadership in the world, in Africa, and I really see that there is a problem in terms of the leadership in Africa, and that causes lags, it causes almost a slowed down growth in what could be a much more progressive set of states, African states. Moving on from that, I then look at, what are the programs being put in place? What is the youth doing? What is the rest of the population doing? And in my own opinion, I like to think of Africa as very it's very vibrant, in the sense of there's lots of different ways in which one can make money, because there's lots of needs that need to be fulfilled. And because of the great need, I'm happy to say that there's a lot of places in which one can find oneself useful within the African context. So if you're young and if you've got a chance to enable yourself and find skills, then that is usually a very kind of like a good place for you to be is Africa, because you'll be able to find useful work for you to do. So yeah, in that sense, I think you can say that Africa is rising, in that its youth, if effectively skilled, whether they are able to access these ways of upskilling themselves is another question. But if they are effectively skilled, yes, they have a great opportunity to effect change in Africa, and in that sense, Africa would be rising. And then the final concluding point would be, compared to what? I mean, whenever something's going up, then we have to look at something going down, or or have a reference point of some sort. And I think naturally the reference would be the Western nations. So the more progressive nations in terms of politics, infrastructure, development, and all of those things, and all of these developmental goals that are set out are usually taken from a Western perspective. And I'm not sure if maybe that's necessarily the most correct way of defining progress, or defining whether a nation is rising or not. I think that if you're empowering your peoples, and if you have great leadership, and if you are creating good infrastructure for your nations, those are very good aspects to define whether your nation is rising. Or some of these are reflected in Africa. But the reference point that we do have as Western nations, to see if Africa is rising or not, I would like to say that it is, because we've watched some Western nations starting to reach a point of decline, even to a point of stagnation, whereas Africa is still a very vibrant and it's showing lots of growth towards that. I mean, the great growth might not be as great as China's, but that's even that their growth is starting to decline. But in that kind of sense, I would like to maintain my position that Africa is rising. Yeah, I hope that's been informative. Those are my own opinions. I'd love to hear everybody else's. And greetings from South Africa.
The question whether Africa is rising, if we take it from an educational point of view, maybe we should say it differently. If you look at the access to education, there have been a massive expansion to universities. We had in the 50s, during independence years, we had like 6 universities within the continent, and in 2012 we already had about 800 institutions of higher learning. So as far as that expansion to access to education, of course it's Africa rising. And I think the hunger comes also from much more awareness of what education can do. That's one. But also, of course, there is the need, what we have seen from success in other areas, that people who are educated can do A, B, C, D, as well as the push, of course, from the government, especially in the 60s and 70s, on the importance of creating that ruling elite that will take over the running of the country. So as far as access is concerned, of course, Africa is rising. The troubling thing is the expansion in education does not necessarily go hand in hand with the improved quality of that education. And consequently, we also have some issues with then, if the quality is not improved, is this education then that useful? We do understand, of course, very well that the most fast expanding sector within the continent is the private sector, and that's expanding very well. Do we need education for that? I would doubt a bit. Do we need the proper provision for those people to be able to do entrepreneurship and achieve the goals they want to achieve, which is needs much more political will probably than education? Yes, we need that very much. So yes, Africa is rising. There's a lot of awareness of personal development, and people want to develop themselves. And I do believe the changes in politics in the 80s, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall, much more communist, much more controlled. The government was the center of the universe, and now much more things have been are going back into the hands of people, and that's a good thing. For an expanding continent with such a young population, that can only be a good thing.